Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I'm going to ask a question about whether human reality denial breached the evolutionary psychological barrier of mortality, salience. Now, if you look at my title versus my positions at UCSD, you can tell that there seemed to be some incongruity in these two things. But actually, there's not as much as you think. In a former life, I was a practicing clinical oncologist, gave chemotherapy to a lot of people in the early days when it hardly ever worked. So I think I've seen a lot of death in various conditions. But the other thing that connects me to this topic is my interest in anthropogeny. Although my lab mostly studies molecular cellular biology of sialic acids and human-specific diseases, I'm interested in explaining human origins, and that's because we found a molecular difference between humans and chimpanzees. So usually when I give talks, I stick to my molecules, but occasionally I venture out beyond my expertise. And one time, in the University of Arizona, I gave a talk where I said a few things about what might make us human, and when I sat down for lunch, this guy sat next to me and said, "You're all asking the wrong question." And this was an insect geneticist, professor of cell biology, and the point that Danny made was the following, that we shouldn't be asking what made us human. There have been elephants, dolphins, whales, apes, corvid birds, large-brained, social, warm-blooded animals around for tens of millions of years. So why aren't we competing with other intelligent species? In other words, why aren't we competing with a human-like elephant or a dolphin today? And so that was a question I thought was a rather contrarian view of asking about humans. And so we sat for a while after that and talked for an hour or two. And I tried to urge him to publish something. But I tried to follow up with him a couple of years later and looked him up on the internet and found his obituary. And then I looked around, found he had published nothing, and finally wrote a letter to Nature about his idea with some of my embellishments. And I thought I'd done my duty when I got an email from his widow, Sharon, who said that Danny had actually been writing a book, and could I please finish his book? So this was a moral, intellectual imperative I couldn't let go. So I decided I would do it, but there were really a lot of problems. First was that one author was dead, and I was trying to preserve his original intent in prose as much as I could. And I'd only met him once. The second is there was no time to do justice to it. And the third is, who would care about a book by a dead insect geneticist and a living physician scientist who claimed to explain the origins of the human mind? But Mary Evans and Carrie Goldstein suggested that I should pursue this. And Hurricane and Superstorm Sandy really was a big part of the story, but that's for another day. And of course, because of the situation, the book was hastily written, not very well polished, and also poor follow-through. I didn't go on any of the TV circuits or any of those things. And last was the problem that the book title provided by the publisher, they control the title, was denial. So it seemed to me this was a sort of a very common and hackneyed term with many, many meanings. And indeed, if you looked in Amazon, you not only find the famous Denial of Death, but you find numerous books about denial. In fact, you can go on and on. Denial. There's denial of this, denial of that, so on and so forth. It seems to be a very, very, very common theme. But as I looked at all these books, I realized that maybe the publisher and literary agent were right, that there is something going on which is actually found in other very common books, such as you see down here, that seem to be talking about the same kind of thing overall. And so, in fact, in my own experience in medicine, exercise, diet, tobacco, obesity, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, hygiene, red meat. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here. You all know how what's supposed to do. But actually physicians are even worse than others in following their own suggestions. Denial of scientific reality, biological evolution, climate change, claims for magical cures, claiming that vaccines don't work, continuing to persist to the vaccine-autism link, UFOs, false cancer risks, and fear of all GMOs. And then, of course, you have societal denial of practical reality. Each of you owes a $200,000. Healthcare costs, end-of-life costs, covert racism, population growth, and insisting on rebuilding in the places where the worst natural disasters keep happening. So, and of course, there are examples of political distortion of reality, and these are familiar to us today, but to be fair, they also exist at the other end of the political spectrum. So one thing Danny had done was to put various cartoons in his draft, and I found one that really summarized it. Denial springs eternal. It's not denial, I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. And so, in thinking about it, I couldn't really find a term that explained what Danny had started and what I was trying to say. So I made up a term, which is, if you forgive me, which is not in the dictionary, reality denial, a subconscious defense mechanism characterized by refusal to acknowledge or rationalization of unwanted or unpleasant facts, realities, thoughts, or feelings. And I think I've shown you enough lay evidence to tell you that this is a feature of humans. This is a very, very common feature of humans, which people have commented on in many, many different ways. And so you can add this to the list of many unusual, exaggerated cognitive features of humans, this capacity for reality denial. But from the evolutionary perspective, this should be a maladaptation. Any individual who practices excessive reality denial and takes excessive risks would eventually be taken out of the evolutionary game, and there should be a failure to fix the genotype. So it raises the question, how and why did this excessive reality denial and risk-taking evolve in humans? And what are the benefits that outweighed the negative consequences? So this brings up the other part of what Danny was trying to say, which I've updated, the independent evolution of self-awareness. And it turns out that, I'm not an expert on these things, but I've read enough to find out that whether or not you believe the mirror self-recognition test is the best, by various criteria, corvid birds, elephants, apes, dolphins, etc., have some awareness of themselves, some kind of self-awareness. So the question I asked was, are animals and birds with awareness of their own self also aware of the self-awareness of others of their own kind? In a sense, I was obviously talking about a well-known phenomenon called theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives to oneself and to others, and to understand that others have similar beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives, are similar or different. And of course, as you experts know, there are many, many other terms, intentionality, attribution, perspective taking, and various components of this. So as I read more, I found that there was a continuum in the development of this in human ontogeny with a 2-year-old human. Actually, I observed this in my own daughter, and a kind of rudimentary theory of mind in a 3 or 4-year-old, and what one might call a full theory of mind in a 5-year-old who can tell excellent lies. And of course, in the adult human, you have this extended theory of mind, which now is 1 billion minds across the internet. And of course, this is a continuum. It's not some kind of stepwise progression. So the question is, why is it so well developed in adult humans and apparently not in other species? And so I'd like to suggest that that what Danny was trying to say, I coined another term, if you forgive me, and evolutionary psychological barrier that has stopped everybody else in their tracks, perhaps explaining why there's just one of us. So now let's go to the theme of this symposium, death risk. Perhaps there's a continuum there, and there seems to be. Many animals probably have an automated reaction to death risk, awareness of death risk. But I think Jack London in White Fang puts it well when it comes to at least some mammals. He had no conscious knowledge of death, but like every animal of wild, he possessed the instinct of death. To him, it stood as the greatest of hurts. It was the very essence of the unknown, the sum of the terrors of the unthinkable, one culminating an unthinkable catastrophe that could happen to him. This is the wolf, about which he knew nothing, but about which he feared everything. So in other words, it's very likely that many warm-blooded species have a very, very well-built death risk response. And so then the question comes up, and you heard a wonderful talk about it, awareness of death of another individual. And interestingly, these very same species, and you've heard examples about apes, there are various reports about these creatures being right on the edge. They're almost getting it. They're just about understanding death. So this, of course, is mortality, brings up the question of mortality salience. Are you consciously understanding the realization of your personal mortality as opposed to the death of another conspecific? And I would argue that this death anxiety that comes up with extended theory of mind would result in the understanding of mortality of other individuals and in the understanding of one's personal mortality, in those few individuals that develop this ability. And perhaps this is the psychological evolutionary barrier that I'm talking about. And of course, those few individuals in that situation would have reduced fitness and low probability of passing the genotype. And in fact, the world's literature is full of these kinds of things, not just Becker and Voltaire. I'll quote from the Mahabharata. The Yaksha asked the great 18 questions. What is the greatest surprise? Yudhishthira replied, people die every day, making us aware that men are mortal, yet we live, work, play, plan as if we are assuming to be immortal. What is more surprising than that? So the question is whether mortality salience was a barrier to establishment of an extended theory of mind in a species. So the argument again is the extended theory of mind would, when that becomes established or starts to become established, results in awareness of mortality, which releases the innate death anxiety that any such species would have, which will result in a failure to fix the genotype successfully. So we've earlier argued that excessive reality denial and excessive risk-taking could also fail to fix the genotype. So what if this combination occurred of two very, very uncommon, rare mental activities combined to allow tolerance of death anxiety and establish combination in the species? In other words, two rare evolutionary maladaptations coincided to allow the mind over reality transition that I'm suggesting. So in a more expanded view of this, you can have a species with complex social organization, with a long life, maternal empathy, instinct, helpless young, cooperative breeding, such as you see in many mammals. Eventually some level of self-awareness and basic theory of mind. But as long as there was observing the death of another individual with a basic theory of mind would probably have an incomplete consequence, whereas an extended theory of mind would result in awareness of personal mortality, psychological terror, failure to reproduce, and failure to propagate. So the suggestion is that you have to have this combination, which then allows you to deny mortality, psychological tolerance, successful reproduction, benefits of extended theory of mind, perhaps other mechanisms. As my friend Pascal Gagnon pointed out to me, especially for males, having the ability to hold false beliefs, self-deception, optimism, and confidence would be a very great mating strategy. So the question is this what we're talking about in behaviorally modern humans? So this is a hypothetical singular phase in human evolution in which mortality, salience, and maladaptive death anxiety were triggered by acquiring extended theory of mind, but was stabilized by simultaneous acquisition of reality denial in the same minds. So if you just do an experiment and take out reality denial from this list of unusual features of humans, several features get dimmed. But if you take our theory of mind also, you lose a lot of features of humans, if you take away that combination. There are other consequences besides denial of mortality. Oops, that didn't go. This is a picture from my native India, from a hotel room. Now, all of these people must have a tremendous theory of mind of all the other people on the road. Otherwise, you'd never be able to pull this off. At the same time, I would predict that at least 10% of people have recently lost a loved one or have had a near miss themselves. And so the only way you can do this is with reality denial, I would argue. So when did this happen? The information is rapidly evolving as of the last few years, actually. But in general, we know that we came from 5 to 10,000 humans in Africa, spread across the planet over the last 50, 100,000 years, give or take. And just about that time, you start seeing, first in Africa and then elsewhere, symbolic art, complex tool making, personal ornamentation, burials with grave goods. Just the kind of features you might expect to see if a full theory of mind was appearing. So these behaviorally modern humans replaced all the closely related species of a few 10,000 years of limited breeding. I'm going to go quick over some of this. It's rather different from other species. We are the lone survivors, masters of the planet. And the question is, why are there no persisting hybrids? That's a discussion we can have later. But I wrote a little thought experiment dating the origin of us, suggesting that perhaps at this juncture of anatomically modern humans went through this transition. Regardless, this transition can explain extended theory of mind, reality denial, self-deception, false belief, overarching optimism, bias, irrational risk-taking, recent emergence of dominant species, and replacement of other species. So in the last part of the talk, I want to obviously try to address some of the obvious criticisms that may come. So any theory that makes progress is bound to be initially counterintuitive, especially if it comes from the wrong person. So of course, I'm well aware of terror management theory, and Tom is here. And I think this fits perfectly, because I think what's going on there is that this suppression of mortality salience is by no means complete. It's a recent evolutionary transition. And so it's there, bubbling up all the time. And this partial suppression in behaviorally modern humans could explain the need for terror management and some of the features of terror management that one sees. The optimism bias, the Pollyanna hypothesis, the universal positively bias of human language, and the end of history illusion. Humans are irrationally optimistic, as you know. And of course, we also indulge in risk-taking and thrill-seeking behavior. Now, this, of course, could have some adaptive value, because overconfidence and extended theory of mind can lead to success, as some people have modeled, that reacting in an overconfident manner can have fitness benefits. So a side benefit of reality denial is optimism. What is optimism? Reality denial. What is extreme optimism? Extreme reality denial. My grandfather was a friend of Gandhi. I grew up wondering, what the heck was this man thinking? He's going to take on the British Empire with nonviolence? And of course, here's a famous case of extremely successful reality denial, which ended in fatal consequences of reality denial. Does psychological ontogeny recapitulate this claimed recent phylogeny? And this may be a case where it does, as you've heard already, and I've experienced that with my own daughter, especially in non-religious families, death anxiety at about that age. We don't have to worry about it, because pretty soon you have an invincible teenager. And perhaps this is a case where ontogeny did recapitulate phylogeny, and that this is what is going on. Autism spectrum disorders, the difficulties in understanding death, concept of God. I don't think it'd be easy to do a study about whether individuals with autism understand personal mortality, depressive realism, suicide, which I'm sure we'll hear more about, panic disorder, craving for mind-altering substances, positive value of meditation methods. And so I'll leave it to Nick to answer this question, whether you need to understand your personal mortality in order to commit suicide, but that would greatly increase your risk of suicide once that came along. So the great tragedy of science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. And if any of you can come up with a fact that slays this hypothesis, let me know. I'd like to get it out of my life. Of course, there are criticisms. Mirror self-recognition is not conclusive for self-awareness. Evidence for self-awareness in some non-human species is not definitive. The self-awareness in other species may not result from similar processes. Theory of mind is not clearly definable. Chimpanzees may have quite a remarkable extent of theory of mind, although not like humans. Neanderthals left some evidence that they may have had some extent of theory of mind. Production of ochre pigment, obsidian tool making predates behavioral modern humans. Tool production prior to modern humans may have required some degree of verbal teaching, communication, or minimal active demonstration. Autism spectrum disorder is obviously not a proxy for an ancestral state. A form of reality denial is present in other animals. Then the biological mating urge might have suppressed the fear of mortality, and these could have evolved slowly. But I find it hard to imagine that these two things could have taken very long to get together, and I won't go through this next slide because it's just my thinking. I do notice that males and females in the human species have a difference that would fit for a combination that could work for such a transition. And of course, the argument comes back, well, I'm a rational human being, I can deal with mortality, fears, and statistics. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a few individuals, an elephant, a bird, a human, that comes through this wormhole and is all alone, and maybe with a few other individuals, without the ability to understand the fear that has manifested itself. And of course, the proof could come from defined neural pathways to mediate proposed evolutionary changes, and it so happens that the candidate brain regions for these prefrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, hippocampus, amygdala, the fear center, and these are exactly some of the regions that have undergone major changes in humans. And both theory of mind and reality denial, optimism bias, fMRI studies show evidence of activity in many of these regions. I'm greatly oversimplifying. So the idea is that these two rare maladaptations coincided to allow mind over reality transition. And here I'm coming back to my summary. I'm a little over time. Can you give me 1 minute to make one more point?
Absolutely.
The other reason I wanted to get this book written was that Danny Brower said this. We are polluting the earth and changing the climate in ways that we can't predict, and likely at some point cannot easily reverse. If we are so smart, why do we continue to sow the seeds of our eventual destruction? Because we are saddled with a brain that's designed by selection to cope with the ultimate disaster by denying it will occur. And so we treat every impending disaster by denying that it will never happen. Indeed, it is arguable we are destined to destroy ourselves as a species. So this is a slide I show in every public talk I give. Oh, by the way, Danny had this too. A man who carries a cat by a tail learns something he can learn in no other way. We have caught the climate tail by the tail. And Danny still had some fun in his manuscript. The bad news is you've got advanced stage humans. The good news is they're just about run their course. And you should be on the mend soon. But I do want to go back to this slide because this is my conclusion from talking to my friends in the climate field. Absent changes in current human behavior, human intervention, there's a 5% chance of irreversible, global, catastrophic climate destruction before mid-century, a climate holocaust. Would you put your grandchildren on an airplane flight with a 5% chance of a catastrophic crash? Okay, so I'll stop there and ask any questions.
You have time for questions.
Do you think that the capacity for denial is what was selected for, or a consequence of the flexibility of human thinking and increased reliance on sort of higher cortical centers and verbal language and ideas for directing behavior? Do you see the distinction I'm trying
Yeah,
to
and
make?
I know exactly what you're getting at. I remember saying to Danny, come on, there can't be a mortality denial module, right? But by the time I got Danny's manuscript, I realized what he was talking about is a general human capacity to rationalize and thereby deny, but it's also a built-in capacity, because sometimes it doesn't make any rational sense why people deny the things that they deny. So it can't be purely, rational reasoning. A lot of it is completely irrational, and so there is a component of irrationality in it. And I suspect what it is in the fMRI studies I've seen of optimism bias, Tally Sherrod shows that good news travels very fast to the amygdala, and bad news travels very slowly. So all you have to do is an imbalance in your fear responses. But certainly the presence of advanced cognition, such as the anatomically modern humans had, certainly would have helped.
Yeah, which might in turn increase the adaptive value of, a denial mechanism. But I guess what I'm wondering is if another part of it is so the idea is that, our behavior is many people think human behavior is more controlled by advanced cognition, language, reasoning than other species, but it's only partial. So that's one force that maybe, when we encounter incredibly unpleasant realities like knowing we're going to die, that role is decreased, and then when it tries to creep back in, when irrationality tries to creep back in, we tell us that there's a man with a beard in the sky that's going to take care of us so that we don't really die, or something like that.
No,
So the interplay between the
yeah.
importance of rationality and the more basic, earlier systems that drive our behavior winning out, and then rationality being compromised in the service of those more basic things.
Yeah, so I think we are very careful. Looking at modern humans today and saying, what can we do, is different from Danny's original question. Why is there only one of us? Was there a point in time where a few individuals had to transit through this gap? Now, once you assume, this must have, if I'm right, this may have happened 200,000-300,000 years ago, and then a much further development of human cognition may have occurred. So today, we look at humans today and say, well, it shouldn't have been that much of a problem. But I think you put yourself imagine you're a woman who's the first woman who get advanced theory of mind, or the first elephant to see advanced theory of mind. The woman has just watched her sister die in childbirth, or the elephant has just seen his friend killed in a battle. And there's already the innate fear that any such animal would have. And the argument is at that point, there would be a sufficient negative response as to reduce the probability of passing on that genetic combination. But it's hard to, it's not some simple couple of genes or something. It'd be a very complex process. So it would have to be an entire process through which these things were combined.
I'm just wondering, just a small question about if you look at the right side of your figure here,
yeah,
about the link between awareness of mortality and failure to reproduce.
Right.
And what is the intuition there? What's the logic there? Because, we know from a lot of work on life history theory and various other studies of high mortality environments that mortality risk is actually correlated with an increase in reproduction, right? So people are going to reproduce earlier.
Right.
So why would there lead to, a
So
failure?
again, we're talking about humans today who already have this capacity well built in. I'm saying that if there was in fact a psychological evolutionary barrier to be crossed, it had been crossed by a few individuals, few males and a few females, who for the first time were able to sustain a theory of mind. So again, you got to think of it as a point in evolutionary time, not in terms of how humans are today. And this is obviously always a problem with evolutionary theories of any kind. It's hard to reconstruct. So in a sense, right now, it's an argument that fits all the facts, but doesn't, cannot be tested, cannot be falsified. I suspect that studying neural pathways will be the answer. But again, I think we're looking at what humans do today is after we've been through this claimed transition. Yeah.
How would you explain individual variation in denial?
Yeah.
So people in this room, for example, are in less denial, certainly in the science domain,
Right.
than your average person. And so there's tremendous individual variation in denial of reality. And how does your view handle that sort of thing?
So again, I mean, if this was a recent evolutionary transition, it's not a completely well-established, genetically based, in other words, we have the full range from an Evel Knievel to a person who's scared to go out in the morning, and a full range from, senior male university professor who can't communicate with anybody, all the way to Mother Teresa. And so this is why I'm suggesting that this may be one way to address it, and that is that autism spectrum disorders are characterized by reduced perspective taking and much more reality denial by males, and systematizing and optimism bias, in contrast to females who seem to have a lot more empathy, cooperation, theory of mind, suffer more depressive realism and major depressive disorders. So this could be one continuum. But again, I'm not saying that it's not dichotomous. It's a continuum.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ajit, Varki. Thank you.